Next up, introducing Daniil Murzykaev, who has extended his project from last year, now exploring the theory of institutional evolvement by conscious arbitrariness. Let's welcome him on stage.
Thank you very much for introducing me. As evident, I'll be presenting an extensively more adapted theory named the theory of institutional evolvement by conscious arbitrariness. I have left everybody approximately a year ago on that stage of proving to some extent the theory of inevitability of democratic states. At the same time, how sure can one be about this conclusion? And this is what I have investigated throughout the year. The first thing that I will present is what exactly is implied by inevitability of democratic states, because in the very end, it was relatively controversial. Throughout the year, I did manage to come up with a rigorous definition of what inevitability of democratic states would imply. What that implied is the following: that given three pillars to the theory, the potential advantageous features of relatively democratic systems, the nature of the process of democratization, for instance, the fact that it's inherently associated with some extent of economic development, a very interesting fact, restricting oneself to the conditions, or approximately the same conditions under which we currently live in, that actually touches a lot of different domains that could be climatology, biology, that, for instance, the subjects of sovereign states remain Homo sapiens at an approximately the same level of consciousness, for instance. And under those conditions, it has been stated that relatively democratic structures would always prevail in increased power, that means in prominence, variety, under a complex system model, and cyclic motion, because everyone can agree we're talking about a cycle. To specify more about the central pillars behind that claim, the advantageous features of democracies that have been identified were better performance of functions of legal fiction, because as we can agree, democracy, relative autocracy, relative democracy, we're talking about intersubjective realities that has to be investigated in a special way. It exists in a society as is believed into collectively, and it has been claimed that relative democracy is more capable to perform its functions as this intersubjective reality to reunite the people together by obviously granting political power to a wide spectrum of the population. Then, relative democracy is also capable of sustaining this broad satisfaction of interests, unlike, for instance, theoretical anarchy. Therefore, it is capable to promote institutionally sustainable economic growth and development, common sense, because it has a sort of degree of consolidation in it. At the same time, it is also very innovative. It has a very innovative nature in the sense that, unlike relative autocracy, it can undergo many political innovations. It's open to innovations, unlike relative autocracies, where very often the only political innovation is the one to destroy the system. Then, from here follows that relative democracies are increasingly more stable and more resilient to exogenous factors. The majority rule in all of this is also more effective because it allows the, for instance, economical situation to be seen more clearly by the authorities on larger scales. And obviously, it does not plainly facilitate economic growth, but economic development as more than economic growth, such as that examined by the capability approach. The other pillar of the overall theory that is also worth elaborating on is the process of democratization. For instance, it is inherently as I've already said, associated with some level of preceding developments. That is, for instance, political centralization, the formation of the sovereign state itself, as one of the most notable examples. Then at some point, there must be some process of proto-democratization that would be some very limited but still existent expansions of civil liberties. That is what I mean by proto-democratization. Although it occurs hand in hand with democratization, at some point, some sort of dilution of political power usually occurs. It is before real long-term democratization would start. It was usually driven from a top-down way by the elites, but it often exists. Then relative peace is a very important factor. Economic diversity, that's the economy would not be controlled by single monopolies, which will be easy to control by any sort of political system, but be diverse. Therefore, there will be a need for openness to innovation and to make political institutions more complex. But also, another quite essential factor to this are the alterations of those four conditions, the resistance from the so-called relatively pro-relative autocratic force that in turn, to some extent, motivates and pushes that cycle of resistance between pro-democracy and pro-autocracy, those ideas existent within every system. And obviously, democratic decay will involve those conditions, but plainly reversed. So those are the conditions that have been theoretically identified. Now, this is all very interesting and insightful. To a theoretical, potentially philosophical extent, the theory could be largely proven, but at the same time, it would be quite interesting to observe the theory under a new light, under a qualitative analysis, under a more scientific, fair enough, under a more scientific light. And that would be, for instance, analyzing the data that we already have. In my case, I was analyzing the most suitable index of democracy, that the one be created by the Varieties of Democracy Institute, and unfortunately for now limited to gross domestic product per capita as a measure of economic development, to see their interplay on different temporal scales. Now, what has been found out of interest? Throughout the year, many positive correlations. This is all to do with the first pillar of association of democracy to economic development, and the fact that the two factors influence each other in retrospect. That democracy, for instance, facilitates economic development, but there's also an influence otherwise. There is definitely an association. There is quite a strong and significant current correlation and note in statistical significance. I understand that as a relative concept, I like democracy, and usually if a result was significant, it would imply that simply more research is needed, but it is still quite insightful. But there probably is some pattern in this, as seen from the results. For instance, as here, a relatively recent correlation between the level of gross domestic product per capita and average VDAM democracy scores, or for instance, to adapt oneself more towards the concept of real economic developments, not plainly growth. There is a considerably significant correlation between the Human Development Index levels, the latest ones, and the democracy levels. But what is more, of course, those were correlations. Correlation does not imply causation. And therefore, the impacts of the Great Recession from the recovery from 2009 to 2019 have also been investigated. And there was also quite an interesting positive correlation between the level of democracy and the level of linear recovery, obviously not proportional. What is more, even according to the indices that we already have, it has been recorded that relatively democratic structures have prevailed in increased power and variety at least twice throughout history. Obviously, since antiquity overall, and since approximately the Great Depression, the Second World War, that was really the most significant period of democratic decade that has occurred. And since then, they have increased in prominence, power, and variety. This is very great. But there are some problems with those conclusions. For one thing, after several statistical experiments, it has been understood that unfortunately we still lack a proper index of democracy to measure it properly. For instance, many democracy indices imply a minimum and a maximum value. This is totally contradicts the principle of democracy. And the second of all, another coincidence, a contradiction for the principle of democracy, is the fact that democracy indices themselves, to some extent, they're not democratic, they're noocratic. They are constructed on, just a moment, on a very small number of experts, but they must be democratized. Surveys must be large, with large sample sizes of experts, and moreover, they must be cumulative, we must undefine the maximum and minimum values. And eventually, I tried to remedy, to aid this problem, to fix it, by constructing a democracy index of my own, obviously based on the already existing data of VDAM. But it satisfies the criteria. It is cumulative because more indicators of democracy would already need to be accepted at some point, so it is easily integratable, and it is scaled by uncertainty, meaning the standard error, which taking the number of experts into account, that would mean that the more experts would participate in creating a value for a level of democracy, the higher the value would be, because simply more people would confirm it. And just one final word that I do more. I actually apply it to a semi-perfect example where, although the correlation between growth and gross domestic product between, in the perfect example, the two Germanys, is a negative correlation between civil liberties, they are not totally irrelevant. So what is the final conclusion of the presentation? The presentation is that we need to revise the indices of democracies we have, and also the fact that inevitability, well, it is very interesting. Obviously, there is an overall trend, but of use is the overall trend. If we're building from the overall trend, we are inherently creating bias onto analysis on smaller scales. We must adapt methodology. I must adapt my methodology to investigate the inevitability, potential inevitability of democratic states. Therefore, until further conclusions are drawn, in an inspiration of its biological monomer, the theory of inevitability so far is no more. The theory of institutional evolvement by conscious arbitrariness has been launched. Thank you very much. I am sorry for taking way too much of your time.
Hello, Daniil. Nice to see you again here. You're coming back this year after presenting your project last year. I believe this year is an extension of what you've done last year, isn't it?
Good afternoon. That is exactly correct. This year's project is larger an extension.
Okay. What did motivate you to actually pursue in that project in terms of extension? Why did you feel that you had to push forward in that same?
Well, for one thing, for last year, I've already spent so much time. I've already done so much work on this topic, and eventually I became attached to it. And I became even more curious myself and wanted to investigate more. And plus, there was that notion of me not really involving all that much of, frankly, scientific methodology all that much. And while I really wanted to integrate something mathematical, something quantitative, a quantitative basis to my theory, a scientific basis. And at the very end, I thought, I am interested, I'm so curious, why don't I just do it?
Absolutely.
Here I do it.
It's going to be tricky what I'm going to ask you. I remember there was this famous quote from journalists who asked a Nobel Prize, can you explain in a few words, like what's your Nobel Prize is about? And the guy answered, if I could summarize it in a few words, it wouldn't be worth a Nobel Prize. But if you could just choose a couple of words to describe to the people what you've been doing during your project, what is it about?
Well, it is largely about the global trends in governments among the political institutions that are analyzed, the overall progressions, as well as now also the way to measure their progressions, notably the extent of prominence in democracy among institutions. Eventually, I ended up actually constructing my own index, but it's largely about that. It's the global trends in governments, and their subsequent economic development, at first presented under the framework of inevitability of relative democracy, but then I've adapted it until further conclusions are drawn. This is pretty much it.
You developed an index this year, right?
Well, it's not to say that I've developed all by myself. The data was already there.
Okay.
It's just the way I was using the data that was different.
I see. And can you draw positive conclusions out of your work? Because, I mean, like at the moment, if we are talking about democracy and worldwide and things like that, people tend to be pessimistic. Tell us good news, please.
Good news. For one thing, regarding really the most general global trends, as I've described before, inevitability of democracy, I've developed a rigorous definition of what I mean. And there have been at least twice when the process where I was describing, the general trend, actually worked out in an incredible way. What I mean is that the rigorous definition is that democratic states would always sort of increase in prominence, power, and variety in the world. And it has happened at least twice, at least. But at the same time, building from that general conclusion is exactly what I criticize and promote a more grassroots approach to it, because there's a lot more interesting what happens in between. So probably the final conclusion is that, yes, there is an incredible general trend, but really reinforcing it on a day-to-day basis, I would probably not do it and promote grassroots research. And so the takeaway is that, overall the trend, it is quite positive, incredibly, but one should be skeptical about it. Okay. The message is it's rather positive, but one should actually emphasize more whatever happens on shorter time scales.
I see. Really Did you have any question?
I wanted to say that maybe we need to finish soon, but I wanted to ask you, so you love so much this topic that you decided to do an extension, this year. Do you see a third context about this one? There is more for sure, right? About this topic.
Are you going to come back?
Well, I don't see why not. I've been pulled into this so much. I'm doing this to some extent by inertia. I fell in love with the topic.
But that's inspirational. I think that's the way people should do that. They need to find something that they really love about, so they can go deeply into that. And
yes, that's sort of what happens. I will definitely continue. I can confirm that.
Perfect. So
thanks a lot.
We will see you most likely. Thank you.
We see each other.